I/O and peripherals. In this nugget, we discuss I/O, or input-output, and peripherals. When we start off here, we'll talk about one of the input devices you'll have, and that will be keyboards and any kind of a pointing device, whether it's a mouse or a trackball, or even something like I'm using right now, although it's not part of the A+ exam, but I'm using a Wacom drawing pad. This provides my input so that I can, draw things on here and show off all of my crack artistic abilities. Okay, that's about the limit of my artistic abilities. We also have KVMs here. This is very important for input and output because you need to be able to identify what's going on in different machines throughout your shop without having to attach a separate keyboard and mouse to each one of them, so we'll address that. We'll also talk about barcode readers, mostly useful for things like inventory or point-of-sale devices. And then we'll take a look at biometrics as well so that people can confirm with some physical characteristic that they really are who they claim to be. And then we'll take a look finally at one of the input methods that we can use, especially in kiosks or public access locations, and that would be touch screens. All right, as we get started here, let's take a look here at keyboard and pointing devices. Now, one of the things that we've already addressed many times in the past is that you can use a PS2 connection for some of the older traditional kinds of keyboards and mouse connections. These are those round circular connections, and they're also known as mini DIN. DIN is a German acronym of some kind that I can't begin to pronounce, so I'm not going to even try. But the green connector, as you know, is for the keyboard, and then the purple one is for the mouse, or for a trackball. And you can also use on a laptop, if it has a PS2 or a mini DIN connector, then you can use a PS2 Y cable on it, and at the end of the Y cable will be a space for both a keyboard and a mouse if you want to use an external keyboard and mouse instead of the integrated laptop pointing and keyboard devices. And then there's also a trackball. Now, this is really going to work mostly the same as a mouse in terms of its basic functionality, except that a mouse you would move across the desktop. A trackball is something that you just move the ball around with. In fact, that's what I use. I find that these actually work better, and this is a picture of one. I find that these actually work better, especially if you're working with dual monitors or two or more monitors, because I can really just spin this ball, flip it over to the left or right and go clear to the other screen very, very quickly. And I find that it runs much more smoothly than working with a mouse, but that's just my own personal opinion. It's just a matter of preference, really. And what happens with this is there are sensors inside of this housing here that will detect where this trackball is moving, and that's what part of this pattern is that you see on there. Those dotted patterns will help to measure what's going on with it. And then there's a scroll bar here, which you can use to zoom in and out. In fact, well, not to zoom in and out, but you can use it for whatever the function is. It might scroll up and down a page in Photoshop the way I have it configured here. Then I can use it to zoom in and out, just as you're seeing right here. In fact, while we're here, let me just move over a little bit further. Then you can have things like forward and back buttons. You can program these very often to do whatever you want them to do. And I use mine to go forward and back in my browser, my web browser. So this is just an example. There's many different manufacturers. Probably Logitech is the most commonly found trackball manufacturer. Now, most of these devices are going to be connected by USB. Like we saw here, PS2 or mini DIN is the most common kind, but USB is by far becoming more popular, as I've mentioned before. And then you can also use wireless technologies. There is infrared capability. In fact, I used to work for an executive that really insisted on using a wireless keyboard and mouse in the conference room of this pretty successful financial business. And the problem with that was where his computer was and where he sat in the conference room was all very specific. He didn't want to move anywhere, but the keyboard and mouse were usually pointing away from the computer. So it was sometimes very difficult to get the infrared to be able to work properly because it requires, as we saw in our last nugget, it requires line of sight. And so that was always a big challenge. That was a few years ago. Nowadays, it would be much easier because you can use keyboards and mouses, or mice, I guess we would call the plural there, using radio signals. And that can give you several feet distance and pretty good reliability. You just have to make sure that you have batteries in the keyboard, mouse, or receiver, depending upon the manufacturer. Normally, it's just going to be in the keyboard and the mouse, and then the receiver is usually plugged into a USB port, and it draws power from that USB port, so it doesn't normally require power. A very similar thing would take place with Bluetooth as well, and again, the devices themselves may require batteries. And in addition to this, I don't think it's an A+ exam objective item, but a lot of presenters like myself will have devices that we use to advance PowerPoint slideshows when we give speaking engagements at conferences and stuff like that. For example, when I'm out at Tech Mentor, which I think we're going to Florida this year and everything. So anyway, that's the kind of thing that we'll often use for those as well. I don't have to be at the computer to advance the slideshow. It also uses radio signals. Now, if you have a laptop, then there's a number of different ways that you can use to move the cursor around. One of those is the track point. This is something that came out initially with the IBM ThinkPads, although Toshiba's also had them, a decade ago or something like that. They're just eraser-sized little pointers that appear between the G and the H key on the keyboard, and you can move those around with, you just exert a little bit of pressure on it, and that will move your mouse, wherever you want it on the screen. Some people prefer those. Also, Lenovo has those at the time of this recording. Also, you can use a touchpad, and I think we've all seen what touchpads look like before, but let's take a look at a picture of one. And then here's an actual touchpad that we see right here. And it's just a flat surface that you drag your finger across, and sensors underneath this will detect where your finger is, and it will then move the mouse across the screen accordingly, or the pointer across the screen. There's also a left and right click equivalent here as well. This actually kind of annoyed me on this particular laptop because you wouldn't really know it until you put your hands on it, but this is shifted slightly to the right where most touchpads are. So as my hands were over the keyboard, my palm would probably kind of cover it up just about like this, and as I'm typing along, it would sometimes just touch and drag in this area, and the pointer would go flying across the screen wherever I didn't really want it to go. Really made me mad, so I stopped using this laptop. It was a real annoyance. That's why I had to put a Hello Kitty sticker on here to give me more feelings of peace and tranquility. It's the only way I could find a happy place. Now also, some people don't like those touchpads or track points, either one, on their laptops. So if they're in the office, they'd much rather use a full-size keyboard and a real mouse or a trackball. And if that's the case, you can usually plug those in through a USB port now on most laptops, and it'll be just fine. Or you could probably get a docking station or a port replicator. They're very similar in function, but you could get those from the manufacturer of your laptop. And if you look at the bottom of the laptop, I think I have pictures here. Let me try to find it. Then what you'll find here is that you'll have an area of the laptop that slides or slides closed, or makes it available so that if I wanted to put this on my port replicator or my docking station, I would just simply slide this down, and it would then expose this port here, which I would then use to connect to that port replicator or docking station. And then that port replicator docking station would have the I/O already attached to it, such as an external monitor, for example, maybe a bigger monitor, and the keyboard and the mouse. Alright, then let's take a look at a problem that you might run into as an A+ technician. Here I have a single keyboard that I drew, although it kind of looks more like a cheese grater right now. And then we have a mouse, which kind of looks a little bit more like a tongue sticking out or something. And then a monitor that we have here. And then I'm working maybe on 3 separate customers' computers. Maybe on this one, I'm trying to clean up some viruses that the user ignorantly allowed themselves to download or something like that. Maybe on this one, I'm installing Microsoft Office. And then maybe on this other one down here, we have a hardware problem. Okay, so I might have multiple things going on here all at once. Now, I don't want to have a separate keyboard, monitor, and mouse for every one of these. Instead, I want to use the keyboard, monitor, and mouse that I'm accustomed to using every day, but I want it hooked up to each one of these. Well, what do? Do I go to each one and plug it into the back of one when I'm ready to work on that one? No, that would not be practical. Instead, what we can use is something called a KVM, or a keyboard video mouse, KVM. And what we'll do is we'll plug in each one of these items into this KVM. So I got my keyboard plugged into there, I got my mouse plugged into there, I got my monitor plugged into there, and then out of the back of this, or on other connectors, we have special cables that go to each one of these machines. Okay, and then what we'll have happening here is that you'll push a button on this, and if you push the button that's attached to this cable right here, then you'll be connected to this computer, and you'll have the keyboard, video, and mouse all operating on this computer. When you switch over to another computer, it no longer working on that one, then it will go to this computer. When you work on another computer, it'll go to this computer. So you just push a button here, and it automatically transfers these I/O devices to whichever computer it is that you want to work on. So let's take a look at some more of the details about a KVM switch. All right, now let's summarize a little bit about what we've looked at with the KVM. When it comes to the KVM, first of all, remember you use it to switch I/O between two or more systems, and this is going to include video and also a keyboard and mouse or trackball if you have it. Optionally, you can also add sound to that. So as you switch between machines, you'll also be able to hear the sound. And what happens there is it's the same thing as the keyboard, monitor, and mouse. It plugs into the KVM. There's a sound cable that plugs into the KVM. And then it also plugs into, on the other end, the actual PC that you're working on, so you're able to get sound out of it. And then also in the KVM, you're going to plug in speakers, of course, so that you can actually hear the sound. You can also do this with USB devices. Maybe in addition to the keyboard, video, and mouse, we also want to share an external hard drive, like a USB hard drive. Well, some devices will also allow you to do that and share that storage between each one. This is very useful in something like a lab environment where you have to, kind of hopscotch back and forth between multiple machines, or a technician's workbench, as I mentioned earlier. You may also see this kind of thing. Can't get my pen to work. There it goes. You may also see this kind of thing in a server room, although it's a little bit different in that environment. Especially in server rooms, they'll have a rack of machines that all of their computers are very often only about an inch wide. They're just like pizza box servers is what we call these things. And there will be a lot of times a tray that will slides out, and you can use that KVM to switch back and forth between possibly a couple of dozen different computers in that rack. So that's not really an A+ exam objective issue, but just FYI, another place where this kind of thing is used. Now, as a result of this, by the way, a lot of this is becoming somewhat obsolete, but it's never going to go away completely because you have to work with physical machines eventually. But things such as remote desktop from Windows or terminal services are something of an alternative. For example, when you see me working on my desktop here, what have we got? Well, I've got computer management open, and I've got my start menu here and all this kind of stuff. Guess what? This is not actually the computer that I'm using. I'm connecting using remote desktop. This actual operating system of Windows Vista that we're looking at here actually appears on a server where I installed it as a virtual machine. We'll talk about all this stuff a little bit later as well. But it's all installed as a virtual machine, and I'm using remote desktop to connect to it. In fact, if I drag my window a little bit, you'll see there it is. Okay, there's the IP address that I connected to, and I'm using a remote desktop connection to make this particular video. And then another thing you might use would be terminal services. Again, that's not going to be an A+ item, I don't think. This is more of a server issue where you'll have a server, like maybe it's Windows Server 2008 here, and it's a terminal server. This means then that I will allow multiple connections from other desktops out here. For example, maybe I've got Windows 95 on this computer here, Windows 98 or something horrible, and it doesn't have enough hardware power to be able to install Windows Vista. It doesn't have enough memory or anything, so we can install a little client on there and make a remote desktop connection, which essentially is going to make that type of a connection to a terminal server here, and then we'll actually be running the server's operating system on our Windows 98 computer here, all without having to upgrade the hardware on this older machine. So again, that's not an A+ item, but it's just something else that is certainly current in corporate technology right now. And then here I just have some downloads from iogear.com, where it shows the various types of devices that they have here. This is one of the common KVMs that they have. So for example, you can see by the illustration here, this is where I would plug in a USB mouse right here, USB keyboard here. If I can also use a microphone on this one, so I can switch the microphone function between the different computers. Here's where I'd plug in the speakers, and then this would be where I would plug in my actual monitor that I view the sessions with. This would be, again, an external USB connector, so maybe I have some kind of external storage or something like that. And this would be what I would actually put my hands on, would be all of these things. These would be the physical devices that I would use for my daily I/O as I'm working. And then for each one of the individual computers, my first computer that I'm installing antivirus software on, well, that would be plugged into this CPU item here, and then a special cable would plug in here. It's a USB cable, as you can see. And then the other end of this cable would be common A connectors that would go into the same USB ports that would normally plug in a keyboard or a mouse on that particular computer. So just plug in all the corresponding connections here, and again, most of these have their own unique cables that have been made for you, and then I can switch back and forth between all of these different computers. Okay. And then here's what some of those cables look like that I alluded to earlier. Let me, push in a little bit here, and we'll see them a little bit better. This would be, for example, on the client end of things, where the individual computers that I'm trying to, install antivirus software or something on, I'd plug that into the sound. I'd plug that into the microphone. I'd plug this into the USB port. That would be then give it the ability to detect my keyboard and mouse functions. And then on the other end, I would plug in the corresponding connections here. And then again, you can also see, this video connector here as well that would plug into my main monitor. Another thing to keep in mind with this, let me move over here a little bit further, is that when I want to switch back and forth between multiple computers, if this KVM is within easy reach, I just hit the button, just press that, and that would switch me to the CPU 1, or the first computer that I'm working with, the second computer, third and fourth. So you get the idea there. However, you can also use keyboard hotkeys. So, for example, I'm using an item very similar to this one we're looking at right now, and I just hit Control twice and then the number 2 and Enter, and that would switch me over to my server. So that's how this actually works. Now, you're probably familiar with barcode readers of various types. You kind of know what these are, I'm sure. They're for product identification. Once the product has been identified, then it's up to programming of some kind or a database to determine what happens with that information. For example, if you worked in a warehouse, you might scan devices on a shelf so that you can take inventory of what's there. And then when you scan those devices, it would probably store that information in a central database somewhere. There's also retail environments. You know how this works. You go to Walmart, you pick up your Snickers candy bar, you drag it across the scanner in the self-checkout lane, trying not to think about all the germs and muck that's all over the scanner there, and that you just got on that candy bar you're about to eat. Anyway, you'll see that there's lasers underneath there that are reading the barcode off of that candy bar. You know how that works. There's a number of different factors or forms that this can take, though, by the way. One of those types is a pen form factor, and with this it really just looks like a pen, but it has a light that is emitted out of the end of it. And then if you have some kind of a barcode here, then you just drag the pen across it and it reads the barcode, and then it enters the data into the database or whatever. There's also the laser type. That's the kind you most likely see in retail environments and at the grocery store and so forth. These are often going to be kind of in the shape of something in the shape of a gun, not quite completely looking like a gun, of course, but you get the idea there. And then there's CCD and CMOS types of sensors as well. What these are actually the same kind of sensors that are in digital cameras, but on these types of devices, out of the end of the gun would be a light that emits light onto the barcode, and it shines it onto it. And then the CCD or CMOS device or sensors pick up or read the light that's been reflected off of the sensor, and it can detect the shape of this barcode, and then it enters that data into the database. And some of the rest of these are just plain old cameras that can read as well. The interfaces you can use for barcode scanners are going to be RS-232 or serial ports, or PS2 ports, but not very often. You'll still see some of these, and the reason for that is because even though serial is kind of slow and dogged, it's just very, very reliable. So that's one reason why some people still use serial, but USB is gaining traction as well and still very popular, and so I think you're going to see plenty of that as well. And then here's just an item that I picked up that I show you from Alibaba.com, and this is just one of the barcode scanners that's available. This one's a CCD barcode scanner. So there's sensors in this that would then be able to read the data. And then there's another one that's available as well. This would be more like a laser type. You can see it's shining a laser on it. This is the front side of one. You can again see, the red protective plastic that's over the top of it and so forth. So you get an idea there of what the barcode scanners look like in their physical factor. An additional type of a peripheral that you might use would be biometrics. Now, this also relates to security because it helps to ensure that only the person that truly is who they say they are is able to usually log on to computers. That's very frequently what these are used for, is logging on. Although outside of the PC realm, they can also be used to gain access to secured areas. But what they'll do is measure physical characteristics such as a fingerprint against a known previous record. What happens is you have to usually with fingerprint scanners, you have to register that fingerprint. So, for example, if this is your fingertip and this is your fingerprint on the tip of your finger, then what you'll do is you'll run it across the scanner. It'll usually get run through a mathematical algorithm where at the end of it, it just generates a bunch of gibberish, A1, KZ5, some convoluted number, where it then stores that into a database of some type. Then when you scan your finger again against that same scanner, it should generate the same hash, and they can confirm that it's actually you. You don't need to know those details for the plus exam purposes, but that's just an FYI, and that helps to prevent the actual photograph or picture or the actual fingerprint from being stored in a database that could then potentially get exploited. This is also a non-reversible hash usually, so that persons cannot use the same math to generate the fingerprint by reversing the math this direction. Okay. Anyway, that's the idea of how that works. This identifies you as indeed who you say you are. Sometimes this may also require a PIN. So you swipe your finger across the scanner, and then you also have to enter in a PIN, so it's something that you possess, your fingerprint, and something that you know, kind of a double level of security. Fingerprint scanners are the most frequently used types of biometrics, although I have also seen optical scanners. For example, a friend of mine who's in the law enforcement community took me to a shooting range in Scottsdale, and there's a special area of this shooting range that I guess you have to pay a membership for or something like that, and they have an optical scanner there, so you have to go up there and apparently read your retina or something like that, and then the door will magically open and you'll get to go in and smoke cigars with the rich and wealthy or something like that. I don't know. So anyway, you'll see other types of biometrics, but again, fingerprints are the most often used. They can be integrated into the computer. Mostly that's going to appear in laptops, and usually it's going to be on the face of the laptop, and you'll see that. And then there's also serial port scanners that can be connected, or USB port scanners that can be connected. And they'll also have to integrate with whatever the device manufacturer's fingerprint scanning software is as well. And then this is just a photograph of a fingerprint scanner on one of my own laptops. And what you do with this is just drag your fingerprint, down this direction across this fingerprint scanner, and then it's able to read it. And that's pretty much it. I will have to say, though, as well, these fingerprint scanners are very often flaky. I mean, you'll drag your finger across it, and it will give you a message saying that it was a bad read and to try again. It may even also tell you that you dragged it across too fast or too slow, or that you had a bad attitude when you did it. And there's sometimes just will not read, even though you're pretty sure that you're dragging it across properly. The only thing to think about there is make sure that you're dragging across the same fingertip that you registered. And a lot of these biometric devices will allow you to register more than one fingertip as a backup. I don't know, just in case one, you get a bandage, you cut your finger and you get a bandage over your fingertip. Well, then how are you going to be able to log on? So it'll also often allow you to register multiple fingertips just in case. Now then, another type of an I/O device that you would have would be touch screens. And the uniqueness of this is that normally a video monitor or a screen is only going to show you output. There's not really a design there for input. However, with these, you can provide input simply by touching the screen. And you've probably used something like this at the self-checkout line at Walmart or a home improvement store or the ATM. All of those are very similar in how they work with that. These are generally designed for some kind of public access or easy access where a user doesn't have to log on or know a password or do normal kinds of things like that. Very often these are also going to have some kind of a custom software installed for them that's not Windows, and it's not something that would be commonly recognizable. It's usually something a retailer or a bank or somebody like that has come up with. And very often you'll also see these things in kiosks, for example, maybe at a trade show, where you can walk up to one of these, push the button of the product that you want to see and on the screen, and then it will show that to you, for example. And then point of sale, like I mentioned earlier, at your home improvement store or Walmart or whatever. The video, again, is normally output only, but now what we can do is to have input using a couple of different methods. Number one, you have to have the technology on the screen that will detect where you've placed your finger or what you've pushed on, and then that data will be transmitted at its coordinates through the RS-232 or serial port or USB. And of course, both of these are easily available. Again, RS-232 is highly available, and we don't need a lot of throughput, so the slow speed is fine. But USB is becoming, again, increasingly more common. Now, the way this works is that when you actually touch the screen, there's a number of different technologies on there on how this will detect where you've actually placed your finger here. But basically, the idea circulates around disruptions. Some of these will have different sheets of material. If we were to look at the side view of one of these monitors, for example, like a really fat one, there might be some kind of a laminate on top, and then in between there might be just an air gap. This might just be air right in here between these layers, for example. And then what happens is when you press this down, then it will detect a disruption in there. This could also be filled with certain kinds of light waves, infrared in particular. Some of them even use ultrasonic waves. So the basic idea here is whether it's electronic, whether it's because of an air gap, whether it's because of a disruption in light signals like infrared light signals, or because of a disruption in audio signals, particularly the ultrasonic waves, there's just a disruption that will identify where exactly you have pressed down on this item right here, and then it will identify where that was, identify the coordinates, and send it to the software that it was designed to interpret that press. In this nugget, we talked about input and output and peripherals. And by the way, they're very often the same thing. A keyboard is a peripheral, but it's also an input device, for example. We also took a look at various pointing devices, such as trackballs or mice, or even things such as this drawing pad that I'm using to draw on the screen with right now. A lot of times graphic artists, photographers, and folks like that will use these types of devices. There's also the KVM, or keyboard video mouse, which you can use to switch back and forth between multiple physical computers without having to have a separate keyboard video and mouse device attached to each one of them. We took a look at barcode readers, which of course are a great way to take inventory, for example, or to scan a barcode in a device, or for point of sale types of contexts. We took a look at biometrics as well. Probably the most common one, again, is the fingerprint scanner, but there are also other types, such as actually facial recognition or optical scanners for retinal scans. Then there's also touch screens, which use a disruption in the surface of the panel to be able to identify where a user has touched that screen. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.